Effort has this deceptive way of masquerading as progress. It convinces you that if you're not pushing harder, grinding more, controlling every variable, then you're not really trying. But beneath all that hustle, there's just resistance dressed up as ambition. And most of the time, you're fighting battles that don't need to be fought. It's strange how much energy we burn trying to muscle our way through life, forcing doors that were never meant for us, chasing outcomes we think we need, defending positions that don't even matter. You wake up already tense, planning your attack on the day like it's something to be conquered, and you call it drive. But forcing doesn't create momentum, it creates friction. It keeps you locked in a struggle where every step forward feels like dragging weight uphill. It doesn't make you more effective, more successful, or more capable. It just makes you tired. And the second you pause, even briefly, you notice how much of your strength was being wasted on resistance that served no purpose. You begin to see the cycle. The goals you forced last year, most of them didn't bring what you thought they would. The ones that mattered, they unfolded naturally. Not because you stressed over them, but because you allowed space for them to emerge. Force didn't create the breakthrough. Alignment did. And here's what catches people off guard. When you stop forcing, you don't become lazy. You become intentional. You stop scattering your power across endless shoulds and start pouring it into what actually matters. And that's when everything begins to change. Not because circumstances suddenly cooperate, but because you're no longer treating life like an opponent to be defeated. The tension starts to fade. You stop clenching so hard. You give yourself permission to move with ease again. Not because all the challenges disappeared, but because you finally understood you don't need to exhaust yourself just to prove you're committed. And when that realization lands, when forcing loses its appeal, that's when life begins to open up. Most people don't see it, but forcing is just the ego trying to feel important when it's insecure. It's like a broken compass, constantly pushing you toward more, faster, harder, as if effort alone will guarantee the result you're chasing. But here's what it misses. Force is an illusion of progress. It gives you the feeling that you're in motion, working, striving, achieving, but in reality you're just fighting against the current. You're mentally wrestling with outcomes you can't dictate yet. And the brutal truth, while you're busy trying to control what won't be controlled, life is quietly presenting pathways right in front of you. Opportunities drift past you. Clarity slips away. You lose access to flow, to inspiration, to natural timing, not because they aren't available, but because force makes you deaf to them. The real transformation happens when you stop asking, "How do I make this happen?" and start asking, "What if I trusted the process even when I can't see the end?" That one shift changes the game because strength isn't built by manufacturing outcomes. It's built by showing up without attachment. It's built by understanding that you can move towards something without suffocating it, that you can hold intention without gripping it so tight it dies in your hands, that you don't need to have every step mapped out. You just need to stay clear enough to recognize the next one when it appears. When you stop trying to force the path, you stop needing to control the journey. You learn to navigate instead of dominate. You trust that whatever needs to happen will reveal itself. Not perfectly, not on your timeline, but with timing that serves you better than your plans ever could. That's when life starts moving differently. Relationships deepen. Decisions feel natural. Even setbacks don't destabilize you because you're no longer interpreting every obstacle as proof that you're failing. You stop reacting from desperation and start responding from trust. And people feel it. Your energy transforms. You're no longer radiating tension in your words, your movement, your presence. You move with intention, but without urgency. You speak with purpose, but without force. You stop trying to micromanage every variable and start becoming the kind of person who doesn't need to. Because your calm alone creates momentum, and that's when the world around you begins to respond. Not because you demanded it, but because you stopped resisting it with effort. Here's something that might land hard. A lot of the struggle you think you're in isn't actually necessary. It's drama created by force. You're not always blocked by circumstances. You're blocked by your insistence on how things should unfold, the timeline you've decided is right, the specific path you've convinced yourself is the only way. Force has a way of turning simple situations into wars. A minor delay becomes proof you're off track. A closed door becomes evidence you're not meant to succeed. One unexpected shift and suddenly your whole vision feels like it's crumbling. But what if you didn't resist? What if you didn't interpret everything as opposition? What if you simply allowed things to unfold without immediately deciding they're wrong, personal, or catastrophic? This is where life begins to simplify, not because you've seized more control, but because you've stopped turning everything into a fight. One of the most liberating things you can do is stop narrating your life with force. You don't need to constantly manufacture progress. You don't need to engineer every result. You don't need to manipulate every situation into compliance. In fact, the most successful people you'll encounter often seem strangely relaxed in the face of uncertainty, not because they've cracked some code, but because they've stopped treating every moment like a test they have to pass. They understand the real truth. Force is just the mind trying to write an ending it was never equipped to design. And paradoxically, when you stop obsessing over making things happen, you finally create space for things to happen. That's where real magic lives. That's where true alignment begins. You start meeting life as it presents itself, not as you demanded it to be. You make clearer choices because you're not clouded by desperation. You take better care of yourself because you're not depleted by constant resistance. You show up in your connections differently because you're not stuck in cycles of control and frustration and forcing outcomes. Force feeds on imaginary futures, but flow, real flow, exists in surrender. And once you begin to taste that kind of flow, even in glimpses, you'll start to recognize something crucial. Nothing external actually shifted. You shifted and reality began reflecting that. There's this underrated power most people completely overlook, and it's the ability to let things unfold naturally, to not rush toward resolution, to not demand clarity before you've even lived the question. Because the reality is, life isn't a chess game you can calculate 6 moves ahead. It reveals itself in layers, in rhythm, in unexpected turns. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is allow, without forcing. That's difficult when your mind's been conditioned to push through every silence with action. But once you start recognizing that impulse, the impulse to control, to accelerate, to nail everything down immediately, you also develop the capacity to step back and question it. Why am I pushing? What am I afraid will happen if I just let this breathe? Who convinced me that success only comes from constant effort? Force tries to sell you the idea that flow is something you achieve after you've bent life to your will. But that's a lie. If you're always waiting for every piece to fall into place before you allow yourself to relax, you'll spend your entire life in tension. Real flow, the kind that doesn't shatter under pressure, doesn't come from controlling outcomes. It comes from releasing your grip on them, from choosing presence even when the path isn't clear, from learning to exist with life when it's messy, incomplete and uncertain, and still not letting it destabilize your core. And this is where everything begins to transform. Because once force loses its hold, you reclaim access to your power, your creativity, your natural direction. Life starts to feel easier, not because circumstances improved, but because you're finally working with them, not against them. The situations might look identical, but you feel different within them. More centered, more confident, less frantic for answers, more receptive to what's emerging. And that's when doors start opening, not because you kick them down, but because you finally stop blocking your own path with resistance. Most people never pause to examine why they're always straining. They just accept it as normal, like background noise you get used to over time. But here's what rarely gets acknowledged. A forced life isn't a successful life. It's a life that's been programmed to survive, not to thrive. We've normalized hustle as ambition. We've confused tension with dedication. And we've been taught to believe that if we're not constantly pushing, we must be falling behind. But forcing doesn't mean you're winning. It usually means your system is stuck in survival mode, repeating old patterns under new circumstances. Here's the reality most people avoid. Forcing makes you feel like you're in control of your destiny, but really you're just white-knuckling your way through experiences, obsessing over how to manipulate every factor while the actual opportunity evaporates. You don't appreciate the beauty of a moment because your mind is calculating the next 3 steps. You don't listen to what someone's really offering because your brain is already strategizing how to leverage it. You're present in body but absent in spirit. But the instant you start recognizing that, not by forcing yourself to stop but by becoming aware, things begin to shift. You start catching yourself mid-push, and instead of doubling down, you breathe. You remind yourself this doesn't need to be forced. This is just a story my mind is creating about how things have to be, and I can release it at any moment. That's when you start returning to your body. You notice the way your shoulders drop, how your jaw unclenches, how your chest opens just slightly when you stop feeding the resistance. You begin re-entering your life, not as someone trying to dominate the narrative, but as someone willing to co-create with what's already here. You understand you can't force your way into a peaceful existence, but you can choose flow right now, not as a distant goal, but as an immediate practice. And the more you make that choice, the more you strengthen that capacity, the easier it becomes to return to yourself no matter how chaotic things appear. One of the most overlooked truths about forcing is this: it's a habit. Not in the way that feels productive, but in the way it gives you a false sense of security. It keeps your mind occupied, gives you something to obsess over, something to manipulate as if the act of forcing itself equals success. But the truth is, most of the time it's just avoidance disguised as action. And that avoidance comes at a price. It separates you from ease, not in obvious ways, but in subtle, constant ones. You celebrate, but your mind's still halfway stuck in planning the next achievement. You try to rest, but there's that persistent whisper in the background asking what else needs to be controlled. And without noticing it, you've constructed your entire existence around preparing for outcomes you might never even want. But here's the shift. When you catch yourself in that pattern, and instead of continuing, you pause, you start rewiring your nervous system. You start showing your body what surrender feels like without needing guarantees. You begin understanding that peace isn't something you'll earn someday when you've forced everything into submission. It's something you access when you stop treating uncertainty like failure. You don't need to have every answer. You just need to stop confusing your impulses with truth. Just because an urge to force appears doesn't mean you have to follow it. Just because a path exists doesn't mean you have to bulldoze your way down it. And this doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you start caring more intelligently. You guard your energy like it's precious because it is. You treat your attention like a finite gift because it is. You stop giving the loudest impulse in your mind all the power, and instead start listening for the quieter one, the one that says it's okay to let this unfold. You're safe in the unknown right now. And when you operate from that space, something extraordinary happens. Your intuition strengthens. You begin knowing what's right for you without needing to force every detail into place. You take action without needing to control every variable. You release expectations and start trusting what's already in motion. The world around you won't always cooperate, but you will. And in that flexibility, you find power. The kind that doesn't need to be aggressive to be effective. You know what's truly rare these days? A person who's at ease. Not because everything's gone according to plan, but because they're no longer battling reality. That kind of flow doesn't come from forcing life into submission. It comes from learning to stop adding resistance when none is needed. Because most of what's making your journey feel like a struggle isn't actually real. It's the narratives, the expectations, the manufactured urgency, the imagined competition, the arbitrary benchmarks you never chose but still feel obligated to chase. And all of that, it can be released. You don't have to force every outcome before you can breathe. You don't have to control every detail before you allow yourself to trust. You just have to notice when your mind tries to pull you into resistance and choose not to engage every time. This isn't about becoming complacent. It's about learning when to stop pushing so hard. It's about moving through life receptive, not rigid, flowing, not fighting. Because life responds differently when your energy changes. People sense it. You sense it. And it's not some abstract concept, it's just that you're finally showing up as yourself. Not a forced version, not an overworked version, just the version of you that knows that whatever needs to happen will happen when the time is right. And not a moment before. Think about the times when things actually worked out in your life. Really worked out. Chances are they didn't happen because you forced them into existence. They happened because you were ready, because you were present, because you showed up without strangling the moment with expectations. The job you got wasn't because you manipulated every aspect of the interview. It was because something aligned. The relationship that mattered didn't form because you orchestrated every interaction. It grew because there was space for it to breathe. The breakthrough you experienced didn't arrive because you demanded it on your timeline. It came when you were finally open enough to receive it. We forget this. We forget that life has its own intelligence, its own timing, its own way of arranging things that we can't see from our limited vantage point. And when we try to force our narrow vision onto the vastness of possibility, we end up cutting ourselves off from what's actually trying to emerge. It's like trying to make a flower bloom faster by pulling on its petals. You don't accelerate growth, you destroy it. But when you water it, give it sunlight, and trust the process, it opens in its own perfect time. That's not passivity. That's wisdom. That's understanding that your job isn't to control every variable. It's to create the conditions and then get out of the way. And here's what's interesting. The moment you stop forcing, you actually become more powerful. Not in the dominating sense, but in the magnetic sense. You start attracting what's meant for you instead of chasing what isn't. You make space for synchronicity. You allow for possibility. You become available to paths you couldn't have planned because you were too busy trying to force the path you thought you needed. And that's when life gets interesting. That's when doors open in walls you didn't even know existed. That's when people show up with exactly what you needed but didn't know how to ask for. That's when solutions present themselves that are better than anything you could have engineered. Not because you got lucky, but because you finally stopped blocking your own flow with resistance. There's also something deeply freeing about releasing the need to force. It's exhausting living like everything depends on your ability to control it. It's draining waking up every day feeling like you have to muscle through just to stay afloat. It's lonely carrying the weight of believing that if you don't force it, nothing will happen. But that's not true. Things happen all the time without your force. Seasons change, your body heals, ideas arrive, connections form, life moves. It's always been moving. You didn't force your heart to beat this morning. You didn't force the sun to rise. You didn't force your breath to continue. There's an intelligence running through existence that's far greater than your individual will. And when you learn to work with it instead of against it, everything becomes lighter. You start to see that you were never meant to carry everything alone. You were never meant to force every outcome into being. You were meant to participate, to contribute, to show up, but not to control. And there's profound relief in that. Relief in knowing you can care deeply without gripping tightly. Relief in knowing you can have goals without attaching your worth to their achievement. Relief in knowing you can want things without needing to force them into existence. This is the paradox. The less you force, the more you achieve. Not because you're doing less, but because you're doing what matters with clarity instead of doing everything with desperation. You're channeling your energy into aligned action instead of scattering it across forced action. You're trusting the timing instead of fighting it. And people who live this way, they have a different quality to them. They're not frantic. They're not performing. They're not trying to convince you or themselves of anything. They're just present, grounded, moving through life with a quiet certainty that doesn't need to announce itself. And that presence is what changes rooms. That's what shifts conversations. That's what opens opportunities, not force, not hustle, not control, just presence, just trust, just flow. So what does it actually look like to stop forcing? It looks like taking a breath before responding instead of reacting immediately. It looks like allowing a pause in conversation instead of filling every silence. It looks like letting a project take the time it needs instead of rushing it to meet some arbitrary deadline you created. It looks like trusting that the person will text back when they're ready, instead of obsessing over why they haven't yet. It looks like doing your best and then releasing attachment to how it's received. It looks like planting seeds and trusting they'll grow without digging them up every day to check. It's small, it's subtle, it's 1,000 tiny moments where you choose ease over effort, trust over control, flow over force. And over time, those moments compound. They reshape your nervous system, they rewire your defaults, they teach your body that safety doesn't come from controlling everything. It comes from trusting yourself to handle whatever comes. And when you live from that place, when you stop forcing and start flowing, life doesn't become perfect, but it becomes yours, fully, deeply, authentically yours. Not the life you thought you had to create, but the life that was waiting for you the moment you stopped fighting it. And maybe, just maybe, that's when everything finally clicks. Not because you figured it all out, but because you stopped needing to. Not because you forced the pieces together, but because you allowed them to find their place. Life finally flows, not because everything suddenly became effortless, but because you stopped making it more difficult than it had to be. You stopped treating every moment like a battle to be won, and started treating it like a wave to ride. And in that shift, in that surrender, in that trust, you find something you've been searching for all along. Not control, not certainty, not perfection, but peace. The kind of peace that doesn't depend on circumstances. The kind that lives in your chest even when things are uncertain. The kind that reminds you that you're okay right now, and you'll be okay in whatever comes next. Not because you've forced it to be that way, but because you've learned to flow with what is. If this resonated at the right time, comment and subscribe. Not for metrics, but to remind yourself what energy you want to carry forward. You're not here to force your way through existence. You're here to flow with it. Let's keep remembering that together.